Now moving on, we now have a panel discussion on ICT standards and scaling. 1 year after the launch of the KS2952, this panel will explore how we can scale up the inclusive ICT standards across the African continent. Please welcome our esteemed panelists for today. And this panel will be moderated by Mika Rachonyo. Mika Rachonyo is from the Kenya Bureau of Standards. In particular, he is a Principal Standardization Officer. Immaculada Plasencia will be joining us virtually, representing the European Commission, and he is a passionate advocate for disability rights. We'll also be joined by Derek Kamali from the Communications Authority, Charles Gashahi, representing the African Organization for Standards, and last but not least, Ashura Michael, who I'm told is on her way here. Once she gets here, she can get to give us experience. So kindly, panelists, make your way to the stage.
I would like now to give what I may call a preamble, an introduction. Because I'm used to talking a lot, I'm not sure if it will be too long or too short. And this is about the Kenya standard KS2952, published in the year 2022. Now, since I'm not sure how many of us are familiar with standards and what the role of standards are, and where is the place of standards in society and in community, therefore I would take this moment to give a brief highlight now. Now, societies are created out of order. So we must have order in the society. If we don't have order, then everyone will choose to do their own things as they want, as they feel. But order is necessary because of some fundamental rights. There are basically three fundamental rights: the right to life, the right to think, and finally the right to own something. There are only three fundamental rights. All other rights, or all other things called rights, are derivatives of these fundamental rights. And therefore, we appreciate why the law is important to protect these rights. So these rights create the law. Sometimes people say that the law creates the rights, but the law exists because these rights exist. Now, standards are part of the hierarchy of the legal system. At the very top, we have the rights, then the various categories of laws, the constitutions, the acts of parliament, regulations, and so forth. And standards find their way somewhere. Standards are found at the operational level, at the technical level. They may not appear at a higher level, but they have a purpose, in ensuring that health, safety, economic rights, by providing an enabling environment and equal field for those engaged in economic activity, business, trade, and so forth. And therefore, by extension, standards serve to protect even social rights. The moment we mention about economic rights and economic activities, we automatically include social rights and social activities. Because in principle, you can't separate economic activities from social activities. No. What people do and what people say that I'm engaged in an economic activity might be viewed by someone as a social activity, and a deliverer or a consumer of a product out of an economic activity may be someone who is engaging in social what? Activities. So these things are viewed together. Now, when you talk of economic, it depends on which side you are looking at it from. Or when you talk of social, it depends on what direction or from which viewpoint you are having. And therefore, we therefore recognize that if standards are there to protect rights, health, safety, and provide a level playing field for business and trade, then standards must also protect social rights now. Now, in today's environment, where we are interacting with so many things, we interact one-on-one, person to person, a person to thing, and even objects also interact with us. And this is now enabled through the use of technology. Therefore, we must ask ourselves one question: how does everyone else interact in the society? So that is the question which we must ask. And because of those fundamental rights, if an entity, if the law allows individuals or people to engage in economic, social activities and their license and so forth, then it means that the same law should ensure that everyone else is able to participate in that context. And it is because we have order in the society, and therefore that begins to give us a picture of the role of the law and the various laws depending on whether they are at the top or at the low. All these must work together. So this standard, KS2952 on accessibility of products and services, was conceived and was proposed to be developed by a partner. Actually, I may not recite the whole history, but in brief, standards are proposed by members of the society who identifies and sees a problem and says, we need a standard to address this particular area. So after this proposal was received by KEBS from inABLE, KEBS endeavored in developing this standard with consultation with the stakeholders. So its main goal is to ensure that in the current environment where social interactions, economic activities, and all its components are carried out with use of ICT equipment and ICT services. Therefore, there is need to include everyone in all this process. And that is, in brief, the history about this standard. It is now a year since it was published, officially published as a Kenya standard, and launched in a colorful event, which I'm sure a number of us may have participated in. So the next question which someone may ask, how does the standard fit into the social and economic activities of our everyday lives? And what do we now do with it, with the standard? People ask, what do you do with a legal instrument? And the standard falls within these categories of, there is a continuum of various legal instruments, from the Constitution, the acts, regulations, standards, work instructions. All these are legal instruments which work together. So the big question is, what next? So those are some of the issues which we might now need to ask ourselves and discuss together. And so at this point, therefore, After that brief or short intervention, I can now invite my colleague, Derek.
So, colleagues, the standard we are talking about is called Kenya Standard ICT Products and Services, and its abbreviation is KS2952. This standard was promulgated in May last year, 2022, and it came with an implementation framework. And to ensure that the standard does not get prepared and is left unattended, we developed an implementation framework that also identified who are the principal implementers. I learned from KEBS that once they develop a standard, it is voluntary. So it only becomes a policy and a requirement if there is an entity that now domesticates it and makes it policy. So we have picked it up as Communications Authority and made it policy for the ICT regulated sector. So for that matter, it means that now this is one of the working principles that must be adhered to by people who are playing part of the ICT services and products in Kenya. Now, normally Kenya is a net consumer of ICT products and services, but we are growing towards the line of manufacturing. So the standard comes with very clearly defined principles on what each of these aspects must provide. In the standard, it is divided into two parts. There is part one on requirements, then there is part two on conformance. And I specifically work on compliance and conformance part. And actually, as a regulator, we extend our responsibilities up to enforcement. So for this purpose, we have picked our part to the regulated side of the ICT players. Anybody who has a license, who provides services, and who supplies products in the Republic of Kenya is now subject to comply with this standard. And I'm happy that Justice Laibuta is here. So part of our work is to ensure that people comply and that we set rules. And should anyone fail to comply or show signs that they want to play out of this rule, then of course we'll approach the justice system to interpret for us. But on our own, we are able to apply regulatory requirements and ensure that the sector grows into mainstreaming of accessibility. So in essence, we have adopted the mantra that it cannot be done without us and it must be done by somebody. Therefore, we have set a beginning date, realizing that we have to grow from somewhere and that we are not at the peak yet. We have agreed that there is a journey to walk. And for that matter, we will begin with sensitization of the standard. So we have begun a program of ensuring that the public sector and the private sector are all informed and they are aware of the provisions of the standard. So there is a partner institution that focuses on government entities, and it's called ICT Authority, or Information Communication Technology Authority of Kenya. So that department helps us to look at the public sector, sensitize all the people, and ensures that they understand what the provisions of the standard are. For that purpose, we have begun doing the sensitization. We have held the initial forums. We have had a forum for licensed entities. We picked the Tier 1, the higher category licenses, people who provide majority of the communication services in Kenya, and we have taken them through a 3 days sensitization of the standard. And we have given it a timeline when they need to ensure they have established a baseline through an assessment framework. So now you are required, if you are a service provider in Kenya, you are supposed to do an assessment for your internal systems if people are going to access your services or they are going to use your services. Are they accessible to the different disabilities or not? And we have now made it part of the periodic compliance reporting. So every quarter, our licensed entities will be reporting on how much they have done to comply with this standard. And the standard has symbol chapters that each person who means well, like we have been told here by the many speakers that we have seen, anybody who wants to live in a complete society, you must adopt disability into your way of life. You must be able to provide services and products that are accessible by all. Now, our intention is to ensure that even the products that come into the country, before they are type approved or type accepted, They have come with the provisions of the KS2952 standard. And this standard has got very simple instructions to follow. And we are glad that we came after the European Union had developed the same and part of the United States. So most of the manufacturers come from those sites. And now the condition for them to manufacture accessibility products has already been spoken to them. Therefore, we don't expect them to be surprised when they arrive at our customs entry that they did not know there's need for conformancy, there's need for accessibility. So our type approval process now incorporates requirements for accessibility. Chapter 5 talks about performance principles. That product, when it comes in, it doesn't have to be re-engineered to be able to be used by somebody with low vision, or with somebody with hard of hearing, or somebody who is blind. There's somebody with a short stature, or somebody with a cerebral palsy. That product, when it comes to Kenya, it must be accessible. And that we have incorporated into our assessment processes. So we have a chapter that deals with generic requirements. This means the manufacturer must make the product with inbuilt characteristics that you only need to invoke. For example, if Julius wants to use features that will be alternative to vision, if you are blind and you want to use alternatives to vision, the product must come already with it. You don't have to go buy a specific product that is meant for the people who are having a vision challenges, or they are impaired in terms of vision. So all disabilities that are possible to be incorporated in ICTs, we have now made it a requirement. And now our service providers, both infrastructure providers and specific ICT service providers, must put this into consideration. When you go to mobile money usage, you need to be able to access your features on the phone without the need for a different product if you're having a disability. And also even the features in terms of the hardware must be accessible, so that any feature that is on that hardware, somebody who is with cerebral palsy, who has got very little effort or energy in the fingers, they still should be able to operate this product. And anything that people use must always have an alternative. If you don't have this, then that product must provide the following alternative. Even in the customer care shops, we expect that those shops will be able to put in place both human resource and physical facilities that will enable people to access the products. So together with the ICT Authority, we are pushing this agenda. So far, we have held 2 conferences for the private sector, and we are scaling this countrywide to ensure that everybody is aware, and we also want to ensure that the public sector works along. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Derek, for such an elaborate outline of what is taking place and what is yet to take place. Now, in society, we have context, and we have entities. These entities are people, individuals, institutions, and so forth. So you might need to ask yourself, what is my role, individual role? And when this standard was developed as a Kenya standard, we have this context of national now. We need now to think about regional and continental. But before we go to that, which Sir Charles will elaborate to us, I would request Immaculada to give us a brief of our experience. Given that the KS was developed from and reflects the EU standard. So I would like to welcome Immaculada to give us a brief on her experience on how this standard has been taken up in the EU. Welcome.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation once more. I will try indeed to tell you how this standard was developed and how is it working in the European Union. We started developing these standards on ICT in the early 2000s. And the reason was that we knew that in other parts of the world, concretely in the US, there was this accessibility standard linked to procurement legislation. And we partnered with the US, and they were revising around 2005 their accessibility ICT standards, and so we started creating a new European standard. We did not have such a thing in Europe before. So we worked together, each of us, US and Europe, on our own standards, but always trying to be coherent in order to ensure that requirements that we would have in Europe or in the US would be compatible, at least, in order to ensure that manufacturers would and service providers of ICTs would have the possibility to have a common solutions for complying with those standards. In 2005, we issued a mandate 376 requesting the development of the accessibility standard, and it took quite a while. At the same time, we had a policy cooperation between the EU and the US, and also with participation, by the way, with Canada and experts from Canada and Japan, in order to make that process harmonized and inclusive. In parallel, in Europe, we were developing also our, let's say, accessibility legislative framework. And we were having thematic legislation, such as the for electronic communication, that requires also some accessibility. We started developing later on legislation on web accessibility, and we have legislation now on so-called European Accessibility Act on the accessibility of products and services. Now, the requirements we have put in the legislation are a little bit more demanding than the standard that we had, or let's say, or a little bit different, because it requires there are other elements that might not be well enough already included in the standards. Let me give you one example. The legislation requires that the emergency communications, in Europe the number is 112, should be accessible for persons with disabilities. This standard, this legislation then has the power to ask for the standard to be updated to deliver for the legislation. So my first message is that the standard is set into a legislative framework that is allowing for enforcement of accessibility. Developing the standard, and I think we followed a little bit the same path that you are following yourselves. So we first developed a standard to know what is ICT accessibility, then we delivered the legislative framework, and now we are revising the standard. The standards have also a very important power, because they explain what is ICT accessibility, and in that context we are also using it, or allowing to use it, in the context of public procurement, in addition to the European Accessibility Act. And also we are using it when EU funds are being spent. It is for authorities to, when they buy or they use EU funds, to they are required to implement accessibility, and as such they can use the standard to know what is accessibility. I also would like to say that in the development of the European standard, we paid specific attention to the cooperation and harmonization with W3C way, which were pioneers in the development of web accessibility standards. Instead of developing different requirements, the European standard refers to the WCAG 2.0. Well, it depends on the version of the European standard, but let's say to WCAG, to the different versions of WCAG. And so that the requirements for the web are harmonized worldwide. This is really important because there is no need, as a previous speaker said, to reinvent the wheel, but rather we should build on each other's deliverables in order to have more to use accessibility and to bring coherence into the ICT accessibility world, and use the resources on accessibility more for implementation, as it is clear what requirements accessibility should have. We continue to promote the use of the standard beyond also the European Union, the EN 31549. And now, as I said, we have issued a new standardization request, number 587, in order to upgrade, to improve that standard. I mentioned the example of, for example, of the use of real-time text and total conversation, which would be ideally interoperable not only across the Union, but worldwide. It would be really good that it is worldwide. We do not have a mandate to make it worldwide interoperable, but imagine the power of having real-time text across the globe being interoperable so that everybody can use it. So I think that by having coherent requirements, this would be a goal to achieve. And in the meantime, we work with our European standardization organizations in order to, as I said, upgrade the standard. But now the difference of the process now from the process before is that now we have a benchmark. That is why it's so important. The standards are made by consensus of participants. They decide what are the different technical provisions. In this particular case, as we have legislation, the standard needs to serve also that purpose. So the level of accessibility should be at least that of the legislation. So I hope I have provided with a first overview of what we're doing with the standardization. Just to briefly explain to you that the products and the services that we require to be accessible are telecommunication services, audiovisual media services, websites, and ticketing machines, services, electronic ticketing related to transport, consumer banking services, ebooks, and dedicated software, and e-commerce. So all websites that perform e-commerce will have to be accessible, and this standard will say how to do it.
All right, thank you, Maculata. There is so much to learn and to glean. As we wind up, I would like to ask Sir Charles to briefly tell us, how do we move from national view to continental view?
Thank you, moderator. Like I said earlier on, I work for the African Organization for Standardization. This is a membership organization that is made up of countries within the African continent. They are represented by the national standards bodies of those countries, and where the national standards body does not exist, then the government department responsible for standards and trade becomes a member of ASO. Currently, out of the 55 member countries, we have 43 member states as members of ASO. Before I come into context, I want to say that the mandate of ASO is to harmonize standards and also operate a conformity assessment system. So at ASO, we are responsible for, first of all, the conformity assessment system, and also a program that implements sustainable standards, just to resonate with what Dr. Raiguta talked about here, where we, through the national certification bodies and private certification bodies, we audit companies and award the Environment and Sustainability Standard level of EcoMark Africa to those companies that comply with sustainable standards. And these are the ones that comply with the requirements of economic sustainability, environment sustainability, and also social sustainability. When we do auditing, we make sure that there is no discrimination because of any form of challenge. So I want to resonate with the members here that standards actually are there to provide solutions. Now, to demystify standards a bit, a standard is actually a document that has been developed by experts and agreed upon by a recognized and published by a recognized body. That's why here we are saying that this standard has been published by the Kenyan Bureau of Standards. Now, standards are at different levels. We can have international, we can have regional or continental, or at national level. So, at Kenya Bureau of Standards, and even at other member states like maybe Tanzania, Uganda, Egypt, Nigeria, just to mention a few, you have what we call national standards. At continental level or regional level, that is where we come in, where we now have the African standards. At EU level, because Makulanda was here, you also have European Union standards. And they have a body called CENELEC that develops those European standards. Now, standards are actually, like our moderator said earlier on, they are supposed to ensure health and safety and protect also the environment. Now, at African level, we are looking at a situation where we are moving towards what we might call one standard, one test, and one certificate when we want to certify. So we are looking at upscaling standards at national level to regional level, so that member states within or member states of ASO can adopt those standards as their own standards. And therefore, standards will normally be proposed for development based on the priorities. At African Union, and we are a member of we are actually established, we are a naming body because we are established by the Organization of African Union and the UNECA. We develop our standards or harmonize our standards based on African priorities, which are actually informed also by the priorities of the member states. So what we are looking at here is, now that this standard was proposed, was published about 6 months ago. 6 months, eh?
1 year.
Yeah, so we are looking at a situation where Kenya Bureau of Standards, who is a member of ASO, would like to propose that standard for harmonization as an African standard. And to implement our mandate of harmonization of standards, we have several technical committees that are responsible for harmonization of standards. So what we do during the harmonization, we call on experts from member states to sit in these technical committees. So once we get the request from maybe KEPS, we will be able to ballot on that document to see that there is a real need for that, and we can see there is a real need for that. And then we are going to make a call for experts to sit in that committee and look at the document as a reference document. And like Emmanuel said, normally in standards development, we don't like inventing the wheel unless there is a real need for that. So we are looking at a situation maybe in the next conference or so, maybe we might be having an African standard. Thank you very much, but if there are more questions, maybe I can give it to him.
All right. Thank you, Sir Charles. In summary, This standard covers every entity in every context, be it that you are in an economic, social, political, or whichever setting or your environment is. The standard has got roles and duties, and everyone has got a part to play. Whether it is how you interact, how you use your words, what you do, ensure the standard expects that there is inclusivity, there is accessibility. I think we may have some time more to interact, to ask questions, either now or later.